I am Brian Champion, the Political Science and World Politics Librarian and coordinator of the library's House of Learning Lecture Series. We welcome today students, colleagues, faculty, and invited guests to hear Professor John Bennion from the Department of English deliver an address entitled From Sparkling to Flame, The Conditions of Literary Creation. The library sponsors two main lectures and lecture series, the House of Learning Lectures and the Alice Louise Reynolds Women in Scholarship Lecture. Through these lectures, the library brings together students and scholars to engage in a civil discussion of ideas, and in so doing, the library contributes to building a learned community which fosters the faithful life of the mind. The House of Learning Lectures series title is taken from the 88th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, verse 119, where the Lord instructs the saints to prepare every needful thing, even a house of learning. Because the library is the campus repository for the literature of all academic disciplines and scholarship, the library is well positioned to be considered BYU's House of Learning. The Harold B. Lee Library takes seriously its campus role as the intellectual heart of inquiry and knowledge, and is honored to provide this House of Learning lecture today. In conjunction with this lecture, we recommend that you spend time in the Special Collections Exhibit Hall viewing our associated display of holographic and typed manuscripts from a wide variety of authors called Literary Worlds, Illumination of the Mind. That exhibit opens today. Now, about today's speaker. Professor John Bennion writes novels, essays, and short fiction about the western Utah desert and the people who inhabit that forbidding country. He has published a collection of short fiction, Breeding Leah and Other Stories, and a novel, Falling Toward Heaven, and has published short work in literary and professional journals such as Ascent, English Journal, Utah Holiday, Journal of Experiential Education, Sunstone, Best of the West 2, Journal of Mormon History, and many others. He has written two contemporary YA novels, Born of Ashes and Snake in Eden. An associate professor at BYU, Professor Bennion teaches creative writing and the British novel, where he has made a special study of the late Victorian and modern writer Thomas Hardy. As a teacher, he specializes in experiential writing and literature programs, including wilderness writing, a class in which students backpack and then write personal narratives about their experiences. And he teaches a session on England and literature, a study abroad program during which students study Romantic and Victorian writers and hike through the landscapes where those writers lived. Professor Bennion received a BA in English from Utah State University, an MA in English from BYU, and a PhD in literature and creative writing from the University of Houston. He lives in Provo with his wife Carla, who is a psychotherapist and a mystery writer, and they are the parents of 5 children. It is a great pleasure to have all of you here with us today. Please join with me in welcoming Professor John Bennion.
Thank you for coming. The exhibit, which is opening today, Literary Worlds, Illumination of the Mind, displays manuscripts of creative works in various stages of publication, from the first spark of imagination to the fire that a published book can start in the world. For this talk today, I've chosen to focus on the grounds of creativity laid in childhood, which result in an adult who can think flexibly and innovatively. These adults open themselves to new ideas, respond in a sensitive manner to inward and outward stimuli, think in divergent ways, create new worlds and new lights which illuminate their minds and the minds of their readers. My title borrows from the librarians who created the display the metaphor of starting a fire. The OED defines sparkling as a spark or fiery particle, a gleam, a sparkle. My question is, under what conditions will a child learn how to fan a creative spark into flame? To discover the precursors of creativity, I made a cursory study or survey of the online materials connected with the display in the archives. Admittedly, mine was not an exhaustive or scientific study. Still, I can postulate that most of the writers who have a recorded history shared 4 experiences during early childhood. They felt relatively secure in their family situation, had access to a library, and read voraciously in that library, knew someone who engaged and encouraged their imagination, and were given the freedom to roam in the natural world. One common myth of artists is that their creative work grows out of a tortured existence. I don't deny that writers need to be acquainted with pain, but most of those in this display experience security, encouragement, and freedom in their early childhoods. Here's some of what I discovered. Bronson Alcott, Louisa May's father, believed children should enjoy learning. After her family moved to Concord, she performed plays she had written and went on nature walks with H.D. Thoreau. Charles Dodson, or Lewis Carroll, lived in a spacious rectory at Croft-on-Tees, North Yorkshire, and read avidly as a child. Orson Scott Card read all the books in the children's section of the library before moving on to adult works. A neighbor gave him access to the great books, and Card read the works of Plato, Aristotle, Euclid, Plutarch, and others. He suggests that the best education for young writers is to learn everything about everything through reading. G.K. Chesterton's parents provided him a sheltered and happy childhood, encouraging interests in art and literature. Charles Dickens was a voracious reader. He read to deepen his education, to escape from the financial suffering of his family, and to nourish a thriving imagination. As an adult, Dickens made much of the financial trials of his family and resented deeply his time working in a blacking factory as a very young man. But his early childhood was actually more congenial. His father was cheerful and clever in his speech, and his mother protected and loved him. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's mother, Mary Foley Doyle, was a captivating storyteller. Doyle later described her influence on his life. In my early childhood, so far as I can remember anything at all, the vivid stories she would tell me stand out so clearly that they obscure the real facts of my life. Robert Graves' mother created a home that fostered intellectual abilities. Edward Bulwer Lytton's mother taught him to read. By age 7, he wrote poetry and had access to his grandfather Lytton's large library. He read everything from chivalric romances to scholarly works. The mother of Eden Philpott saw that he received an education in local schools. He also had time to roam the countryside of Dartmoor. Beatrix Potter, famous for her pictures and stories of animals, enlivened a protected and dull childhood with pets and summer holidays in the outdoors of England's Lake District. Christina and Dante Gabriel Rossetti mingled with Italian scholars and revolutionaries who visited their home. These creative thinkers influenced the children as they grew into intelligent, artistic personalities. Christina was taught by her mother, who read to her and recorded her stories before she could write for herself. She was given the freedom of their library and preferred stories of fantasy, adventure, and imagination. Robert Louis Stevenson, the only child of doting parents, had a nurse, Alison Cunningham, called Cummy, who cared for him. Cummy spent many hours, telling him stories or reading aloud to him from Victorian penny serial novels and the Bible. His father was something of a storyteller too, and until he turned to learn to read, Robert dictated his own stories to his mother and his nurse. Doug Thayer, as recorded in his memoir of his childhood, Hooligan, wandered the streets of southwest Provo, swam in the Provo River, hiked and fished in the mountains, and generally roamed free. I know from talking with him that his mother worked extremely hard to provide a secure home. I believe he also found sanctuary in his mother's clear, powerful ethical system. Jessica Day George and Gigi Vandegrift both claim to be voracious readers, lovers of books. Leslie Norris had parents who encouraged him, told him stories, and gave him a sense of security. He also had an excellent primary school teacher. Many of my own ideas about how to teach writing to students came from Norris or his teacher. On windy days, his teacher took the class outside and had them one by one put their arms around a tree so they could feel the swaying, creaking branches. He used any occasion to teach, cultivate their powers of observation and invention. If a plane flew overhead, that event became the subject for a lesson on descriptive language or science. Two writers in the display who didn't seem to experience safe, free, and imaginative childhoods were Zane Grey and W.M. Thackeray. Zane Grey's father was an authoritarian, threw his stories away, worked him hard, and wanted him to become a dentist. Despite this negative experience, he had a friend, Old Muddy Miser, who taught him the joy of recreation, particularly fishing. He told Grey that he would someday fish a big sea fish. This person possibly enabled Grey to find himself and his voice. William Makepeace Thackeray attended boarding schools beginning early in his life. These experiences, including in exceedingly dry lessons and canings, later provided material for Thackeray's writing. They also led him to find escape by reading the popular fiction of the day. Despite these exceptions, the majority of the writers I surveyed, and by the way, I've quoted somewhat liberally from that online text, and I decided just not to say I quote in the air after everything, but I did quote quite a bit from the online text. Despite these exceptions, the majority of the writers I surveyed had secure, free childhoods with the ability to read all the books they wanted and the opportunity to explore nature. I had similar experience to these writers. My childhood was relatively secure and happy. My mother and father encouraged me to read and think. We had books in our house and ready access to the bookmobile where I could borrow 10 or 15 books each time it came. As a boy, I had the opportunity to explore the fields, ditches, and barnyards in my small desert town. One person who especially encouraged my creativity was my grandmother, who was a teacher and an artist. My earliest memories have to do with her efforts to stimulate my imagination. She led me across the hill behind her house at Green Jacket, where she showed me a pathway through the junipers that she called the fairy tunnel. There was a ring of junipers where she said the deer council met at night. I imagined the bucks, huge as Bambi's father, standing inside that circle. She owned a toy plastic Viking ship. Its sail is cream-colored. Tiny brown men wield the movable oars. I remember an easel in her living room with a painting on which I wasn't allowed to touch set up. She painted detailed, illuminated watercolor maps of her explorers, of Abraham, the Vikings, Columbus, trappers and explorers. More than any other person except for my parents, she encouraged my curiosity about the world. As I prepared for this talk, I next wondered what child and educational psychologist would say about the precursors of creativity. As with my survey of the writers, my research was cursory. I looked at only 3 studies, 2 of creativity in children and 1 in adults. Interestingly, I discovered that creativity has not been studied by psychologists very much until recently, primarily because of the difficulty of defining precisely what creativity is. Robert Sternberg claims it is the orphan child of psychology. In his introduction to the Handbook of Creativity, he defines this quality as a form of problem solving. But he claims it is a special kind of problem solving, one that involves problems for which there are no easy answers. That is, problems for which popular or conventional responses do not work. This exactly describes the writing of a novel, setting up problems in the form of conflicts and exploring complex consequences. Sternberg writes that this skill involves adaptability and flexibility of thought. What encourages this kind of creativity? Sternberg writes that for young children, a non-evaluative atmosphere appears to be a critical factor in avoiding the right answer fixation. However, in many children, this propensity for independent thinking doesn't last long. He writes, through the socialization process, children move toward conformity during the elementary school years. The percentage of original responses in ideational fluency tasks drops from about 50% among 4-year-olds to 25% during elementary school. He suggests that children be given the opportunity to express divergent thought and to find more than one route to the solution. One of his findings supports my thesis that freedom to explore without censure is one precursor of creativity. He writes that rewards or incentives for children appear to interfere with the creative process. Indeed, any external constraint seems to reduce this flexibility. Other studies have shown that structured materials, especially when combined with structured instructions, reduce flexibility in 4-year-old children. What activities engage children who become creative adults? He writes, research suggests that children who appear to be creative are often involved in imaginative play and are motivated by internal factors rather than external factors, such as rewards and incentives. This article report went on to suggest that adults can encourage creativity by emphasizing the generation and expression of ideas in a non-evaluative framework and by concentrating on both divergent and convergent thinking. Adults can also try to ensure that children have the opportunity and the confidence to take risks, challenge assumptions, and see things in a new way. Specifically, they can provide an environment that allows the child to explore and play without undue restraints, adapt to children's ideas rather than trying to structure the child's ideas to fit the adults, accept unusual ideas from children by suspending judgment of children's divergent problem solving, allow time for the child to explore all possibilities, moving from popular to more original ideas, emphasize process rather than product. James Moran, in his essay Creativity in Young Children, writes that the tendency to seek stimulation and to explore new environments actively in early childhood predicts later academic achievement and IQ. Some traits which originate in childhood persist into adulthood. He writes that orienting sensitivity, which includes the tendency to be sensitive to internal and external sensory stimulation, is concurrently related to openness in adulthood. This openness to possibility is one mark of the creative writer or of any creative adult. The third study I examined showed me that the external conditions which enable childhood creativity in children also influence creativity in adults. Anika L. Simmons, in her doctoral dissertation, Organizational Justice, a Potential Facilitator or Barrier to Individual Creativity, writes, although creativity can occur in several places in an organization, it does not come about by mere chance. Creativity takes place when the suitable circumstances are united. In fact, creativity does not occur spontaneously or randomly, but happens instead when the appropriate combination of knowledge, skill, and motivation enable an individual to create new ideas. She suggests that creativity isn't just the product of individual qualities and desires, but that contextual factors interact to produce an environment that is conducive or harmful to creative output. These factors, which I believe apply to both children and adults, are freedom and the confidence that achievement will be judged fairly. Psychologists are not alone in thinking that creativity is made possible when adults return to the openness, the freedom to make mistakes without punishment, and the belief in fairness natural to ideal childhood. I believe that these attitudes enable both children and adults to yield to curiosity and study the natural world with complete attention. Milton Glasser, a professional visual artist, he was the man who invented the I Heart New York logo, said this about close attention which drawing requires. The great thing about drawing is that it forces you to be attentive, and when you are attentive, everything is remarkable. There is no such thing as a boring object. Your shoe, for instance, you might all just look at your shoe, I don't know, is astonishing. The way it's reflecting the light, the difference of reflected light off the white surface compared to the brown surface, and the fact that the heel is not reflecting light. These are visual miracles. To draw well, one must have humility. You have to be astonished by what you're looking at, which is very different from controlling what you're looking at and forcing it to be something that you have in your mind. He praises what is essentially a childlike habit of seeing what is there and being fascinated with it. Children are often unconstrained by emotional or physical restraint in their responses. They are visionary, seers of mundane objects. All these traits are central to the creativity necessary for writers who want to invent new literary worlds. However, the childhood traits of openness and fascination with the world do not always persist into adulthood. As Wordsworth said, the shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy. We grow into adulthood, and for many, the creative impulse is stifled by outward and inward forces. We lose openness to experience because of social conditioning which eliminates risky thought and behavior. We live in a society which seeks peace and efficiency through processed experience. In The Loss of the Creature, Walker Percy suggests that the educational system and other public institutions, such as the travel industry, make fresh apprehension of objects difficult. He says, "Why is it almost impossible to gaze directly at the Grand Canyon and see it for what it is, as one picks up a strange object from one's backyard and gazes directly at it? It is almost impossible because the Grand Canyon, the thing as it is, has been appropriated by the symbolic complex which has already been formed in the sightseer's mind." He's generally saying that a traveler who stands at the edge of the canyon has been preconditioned by pictured postcards, geography books, tourist folders, and the words themselves, Grand Canyon. And here he goes again. As a result of this preformulation, the source of the sightseer's pleasure undergoes a shift. Where the wonder and delight of the Spaniard who first discovered the canyon arose from his penetration of the thing itself, from a progressive discovery of depths, patterns, colors, shadows, etc., now the sightseer measures his satisfaction by the degree to which the canyon conforms to the preformed complex. If it does so, if it looks just like the postcard, he is pleased. He might even say, "Why, it is every bit as beautiful as a picture postcard." He feels he has not been cheated. But if it does not conform, if the colors are somber, he will not be able to see it directly. He will only be conscious of the disparity between what it is and what it is supposed to be. He will say later that he was unlucky in not being there at the right time. The highest point, the term of the sightseer's satisfaction, is not the sovereign discovery of the thing before him. It is rather the measuring up of the thing to the criterion of the preformed symbolic complex. Percy suggests that fresh vision may be regained by leaving the beaten track, or by a dialectical movement which brings one back to the beaten track, but at a level above it. By this he means recognizing that the track is beaten and glorying in its conventionality, saying in effect, "I am receiving a preconditioned experience. Let's see how that feels." Fresh vision is also available through, quote, "a breakdown of the symbolic machinery by which the experts present the experience to the consumer." He uses an example with reference to the Grand Canyon of an outbreak of cholera, which would enable the consumer to see the Grand Canyon in a different way. However, these methods of regaining fresh vision cannot be arranged by administrators of the park, by tourist guides, or educators. He writes that this dialectic of sightseeing cannot be taken into account by planners, for the object of the dialectic is nothing other than the subversion of the effort of the planners. Later in his essay, he describes the difference between an islander walking along a beach and finding a dead dogfish and a student who finds a dead dogfish on his laboratory desk. Also between someone who stumbles across a Shakespeare sonnet and a student who studies the same in class. He writes, "The educator whose business it is to teach students biology or poetry is unaware of a whole ensemble of relations which exist between the student and the dogfish and between the student and the Shakespeare sonnet. To put it bluntly, a student who has the desire to get at a dogfish or a Shakespeare sonnet may have the greatest difficulty in salvaging the creature itself from the educational package in which it is presented. One-way writers keep the eyes of an uninitiated childhood, despite the nature of our processed and pre-programmed world, is to consciously allow caprice and accident to affect the process of discovery. Like Nephi, we walk, not knowing beforehand where we will go. The act of keeping vision fresh depends on forced unlearning, proceeding by not knowing. This idea is expressed well by Milton Gasser. In a supermarket of choices, how do you begin to solve a design problem? Basically, two possibilities exist. One is the professional response to a given problem that emerges from recognizing previous successful solutions to several similar problems, to a large extent using successful formulas with relatively predictable results is professional, yet by definition non-creative. A more meaningful kind of procedure is essentially a blind process where you do not pre-structure and you have to allow information to arise in a spontaneous way, uncontrollable by the will. The most meaningful developments in my work are those that occurred involuntarily and blindly, without my knowing what I was going to do, when I had enough faith in my own creative process to be willing to wait for it to happen without my will demanding it. This means we might profit from allowing what seems to be error to come into our thinking and writing, being willing to make mistakes, maybe grand ones. This world is not designed for errorless learning. We make ourselves bit by bit, drafting and redrafting. In his essay, Not Knowing, Donald Barthelme says almost the same idea, that the state of not knowing what comes next is essential to the creative process for a writer. He says, without the scanning process engendered by not knowing, without the possibility of having the mind move in unanticipated directions, there would be no invention. Writing is a process of dealing with not knowing, a forcing of what and how. He says it involves a considerable amount of fear at the empty page, mingled with the confidence created in childhood by being able to make safe experiments. Many conditions work against our not knowing. Our language, Barthelme says, is much handled, and restoring freshness to it is difficult. Also, he warns writers of the fact that our received language has an ingrained history of manipulation for political and social ends, especially by our contemporary consumer culture. We learn and use a pre-processed, reprocessed language. In my wandering manner, as I prepared for today, I next turned to my attention to here and now, Utah Mormon and American culture. What are the dangers to creativity here in Zion? My first concerns are national, probably worldwide in their effect, that people no longer read books as much as they used to, nor do they get outside as much as they used to. Concerning books, my complaint is not so much in the switch from print to visual media, but with the limiting of choices presented through television and interactive media. A sitcom or situational drama can engage the viewer in a complex manner or in a simple one. The dilemmas of the characters can be deep and evocative or shallow and repetitive. The problem for prompting creativity in the viewers is that the treatment is usually the latter, the shallow and the repetitive. I don't have time to go into detail, but even an engaging comedy such as The Simpsons or Seinfeld soon run out of options for multivariate divergent thinking. They either quit or become repetitive. In similar fashion, most video games, while they claim to be interactive, have a propensity toward limiting choice. The character has the choice of fight or flight, possibly of which weapon to use and how to use it. But even games which integrate some sort of puzzle into the design have a limited number of options. So the action in television or video games becomes limited, consequently limiting imagination, making users passive participants in repetitive action. This happens because the designer has to imagine and create all the possible outcomes. The design is such that the reader doesn't actually participate in creating the meaning of what happens. I don't believe that the new media are necessarily limited. I've heard of games and I've seen television shows which generate possibility, that are open-ended and evocative. Books are not that much different, really. Throughout history, books have been written which are either simplistic or superficial, or complex and significant. However, I note one important difference between books and the current media. If the library the child has access to if the library the child has access to is developed by an intelligent person, it's unlikely that a curious child will stick with uninteresting, repetitive books. With a whole library to explore, the authors I've talked about just moved on to better and more complex books. But when the majority of public media is mind-numbing, limited, superficial, and repetitive, how does a curious child move on to more significant experience? Becoming an indoor urban population has a similar effect, I believe. Human creations are generally simple, ordered, and familiar. The natural world is complex and foreign. For example, a building is more regular in form and detail than a bluff. A chair or table is not generally as complex, elegant, or multivarious as a tree. Our imagination is enhanced, stimulated, created by getting outdoors into areas which have natural chaos and order. Just looking at a forest or a mountain or cloud can prompt seeing with new eyes, responding creatively. Now for my critique of my own Mormon culture. Moroni, when recounting Ether's experiences, says that one meaning of his story is that weakness may become strength. If that's true, then our strength may also become our weakness. I believe that our powerful and important desire to be perfect can result in two assumptions that restrict the freedom of thought necessary for creativity to flourish. The first is our belief that divergent thinking is wrong or even sinful. I've experienced often in classes at BYU or in Sunday school when someone says something that is more mystical, more intimate, more angry, more theoretical, more heretical, or more anything than the norm, and a dread silence falls over the room. We have to allow people to experiment with thinking off the path. If we punish such people too quickly, name them apostates, radicals, or heretics before we understand what they're saying, we will progressively become less creative as a people. Excessive structure and orthodoxy are the enemies of creativity. A creative person will reject the control implied by too much structure. A second major force which is connected to our search of perfection is our disinclination to make mistakes. Writers must always feel the freedom to make mistakes. When mistakes are punished, creativity dies. In my interviews with students, I try to help them see accidents as opportunities, not as mistakes. When someone switches from past to present tense, or from first person to third person, when they confuse time or ideas, or when they yoke disparate subjects together or range in tone, they can be encouraged to see this as a widening of opportunity rather than just as an error that must be eradicated. When Carla and I were first married, we lived on her father's farm between Mona and Nephi. She was an undergraduate psychology student, and one of her professors advertised for someone to take the chicks after they were done with an experiment in errorless learning. The idea was not to shape the chicks by giving them rewards when they pecked the right button and punishment or failure when they pecked the wrong button, but to condition the chicks to peck the right button the first time and every time. Writers can't be creative in an environment where errorless learning is promoted. When I was young, my father gave me Autobiography of a Grizzly by Ernest Thompson Seton. I also read My Side of the Mountain, and I was off. Earlier than that, he recited to me selections from Robert Louis Stevenson's A Child's Garden of Verses. I hope it was him and not you. Maybe you did it. But I don't remember who did it, but somebody did it. Okay? My favorite poem in that collection gives the feeling of play, of freedom to act, of expansiveness. The idea that I'm in a safe place, but the whole world is before me. The poem is entitled, Where Go the Boats? Dark brown is the river, golden is the sand. It flows along forever with trees on either hand. Green leaves a floating, castles of the foam. Boats of mine a boating, where will all come home? On goes the river, and out past the mill, away down the valley, away down the hill. Away down the river, 100 miles or more, other little children shall bring my boats ashore. If we can give our children and each other that same kind of expansive acceptance, what splendors can we create in many different forms, whether in writing, design, software, business plans, or in simply living open and creative lives. Thank you.